Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Have you liked them on Facebook yet? They post a lot of interesting things on Facebook, calls for papers, funding opportunities, PhD opportunities. You should be following them on Facebook, and they've also got a website. So ASA is an excellent organisation. It works very hard to support animal studies scholars. It's one of my favourite organisations. I'm a member, and I encourage you to become a member too. That's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. And we have a second sponsor this week. This episode of Knowing Animals is also brought to you by MC Pony. Now, I've been talking about MC Pony for a few weeks now on Knowing Animals. Have you gone to the MC Pony website? It's veganthused.com. That's veganthused.com. You'll find a lot of information there about the work of MC Pony, what inspires her, what her music is about, why she does it, and you'll also be able to listen to some samples. So get yourself down to MC Pony's website, check out her work, check her out also on YouTube and Unearthed, and get into it. Bit of music for the people who are interested in animal issues. Well, goodness gracious me, this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from lovely London town. Now, the sun was shining this morning. It was definitely shining. In fact, I had my sunglasses on. But as we speak, it's kind of tucked behind some clouds. They're quite grey, but I don't think it's going to rain. So I'm going to say that this is a lovely, lovely day in London town. And I'm very lucky to be joined by Anat Pick. Now, Anat is Associate Professor of Film Studies at Queen Mary University of London. And today we're going to discuss Anat's book chapter, Vegan Cinema, which is in the book Thinking Veganism in Literature and Culture Towards a Vegan Theory. And that book was published by Palgrave Macmillan just very recently. It just came out a couple of months ago. Now, the book was edited by Emilia, Quinn and Ben Westwood. Welcome to the podcast, Anat.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Now, Anat, you're my first ever returning guest, so it's quite an honour for you, I would imagine.
Oh, yeah, it is. A little stressful, too.
So, Anat, we're talking about your book chapter, Vegan Cinema. Why did you write that chapter? What inspired it?
Well, I've been working at the intersection of film philosophy, which is like a subfield of film studies, and animal studies. And this is kind of the most recent iteration of my ideas about the ways in which the medium of film relates to non-humans, especially to animals.
Okay, so you've got quite a provocative title there, Vegan Cinema. What is vegan cinema?
Yeah, it's obviously it's a little bit of a kind of a pun, but not just. It's not just a kind of snappy title. Vegan cinema draws on the analogy between the acts of looking and eating, which is found in the work of my favorite philosopher, Simone Weil, someone I've been working on for several years now, and someone who continues to inspire my work. And Weil says, maybe I can quickly quote her. She says the following. She says, "The great sorrow of human life is knowing that to look and to eat are two different operations. Maybe the vices, depravities, and crimes are nearly always, or even always in their essence, attempts to eat beauty, to eat what one can only look at." So I think for Weil, what she's trying to say there through this analogy between looking and eating is that art, or at least good art, approaches its objects of representation without eating them, without devouring them. And she also says that we want to eat all the other objects of desire, and the beautiful is that which we desire without wishing to eat it. We desire that it should be. And that kind of gave me the idea of thinking about cinema in a similar way, that cinema can look at the objects of sight without devouring them, without destroying them, by just allowing them to just kind of be, emphasizing their autonomy, their independence, their reality, in other words. Now, a lot of film theory, especially dating back to the 1970s, I think most people would be familiar with feminist film theory from those decades and beyond, emphasizes cinema's kind of predatory attitude towards its objects of sight. So famously, Laura Mulvey coined the term the male gaze to talk about how women are represented on screen as objects that are kind of assimilated, objectified, appropriated, devoured in a way, and destroyed. And it's done so for very good reasons. I mean, recently, we've all been talking about the Me Too movement and following the Harvey Weinstein scandal and revelation. So there's something about cinema that is predatory towards the objects that it puts on the screen. But I think that kind of predatory theorization of cinema could be overstated sometimes. And with vegan cinema, what I was trying to do is I was attempting to trace a different trajectory of the gaze, one that kind of lets be the object of sight. And I argue in the chapter that, and in the book that I'm actually trying to write, which is a bigger project based on this chapter, through a number of examples from the very early beginnings of cinema, that cinema has always been a medium that also looks at the world without devouring it. So it follows Wei's notion of letting be the world and not eating it up, not kind of chewing it up and spitting it out. And as such, cinema also kind of preserves and respects and highlights the autonomy and the reality of the objects of the gaze and the world. And this non-devouring gaze is really what I'm calling the vegan gaze. It mirrors, I think, the attempt by vegans to nourish themselves, to eat without devouring, which, we can think about whether that attempt is possible or impossible, or the project is difficult and perhaps incomplete. But I think that it's important to stress the kind of pacific, non-devouring potential of cinema. And that's really what the chapter is about.
Interesting. So there are a few things in what you were just discussing that I'd like to ask you about in more detail. But you're clear in your chapter what vegan cinema is not. So you're not interested in activism on screen or the life of vegans on screen. Why exclude that? What's the purpose of excluding that mode of filmmaking?
Right. Obviously, that mode of filmmaking has its place and it's really important, but that is a different coinage of vegan cinema. So vegan cinema, in the way that I'm using it, is a kind of more ontological attempt to get at the foundations of what film is and how it looks at the world. It's not a thematic notion. So I'm not really interested in this work in films about veganism. These films have their place. They're part of, I think I call them part of the pro-animal toolkit, and they're important for activists. But I don't think it's not enough to just talk about vegans or promote veganism in film. Those things have their place, but that does not fall into my definition of vegan cinema. And I think it narrows down what vegan cinema can be. As I said, I'm really interested in the ways in which many different kinds of films, whether or not they relate to animal rights issues, how they can handle and approach their non-human subjects on screen in a manner that is non-violent. So I'm really interested in thinking about the non-violent gaze. Maybe that's a really short way of summing up what I'm trying to do.
So realism in film is important to your argument. For listeners who are not film scholars, who perhaps don't use that expression or aren't confident in what it means, can you tell us what that means, how you use that concept?
That's going to be a tough one to summarize. Realism as a theory as a way of understanding what cinema is, has a long kind of pedigree. From the very beginning, cinema as a photographic medium was taken to be not just a copy of the world, but sort of an imprint of the world. So the world actually leaves a trace, an actual physical trace on the film strip through, the light. And I'm interested in, I kind of see what I'm doing in that tradition, even though I'm not necessarily limiting my discussion to photographic film. I think it applies also to digital filmmaking. But I do think that cinema is fundamentally, and all art, in fact, needs to tell us something about the world, needs to try to get at the way in which the world truly is or truly works. And the reason why I see vegan cinema as doing that is this little phrase that I mentioned earlier, the notion of letting be, the cinema of letting be, by not imposing itself on the world. Film can, if it manages to do that, film can simply allow the world to exist. And by emphasizing the existence and the reality of the world, I think there's an ethical potential there, because if something exists, we acknowledge its existence, we are already, maybe respecting is too strong a word, but we are kind of acknowledging that there is something other than us that we are looking at, and it has an autonomous and independent or sovereign existence. And that to me is the first step towards not harming that thing.
So in the chapter you take, I guess to me as a non-film studies person, as someone who's not expert in film, you take what appears to be a long historical look at cinema. So you take us back to early pieces of cinema, to say, baby eating or something, I think is it called, or something like that. Baby's breakfast, baby's lunch.
Yeah. The Lumiere film from 1895.
Yeah. So why is it important to you to take that long historical view? Is there something about demonstrating how the history of film feeds into what you're discussing, or that vegan cinema has always been present in some non-conceptualized form? Or
precisely. I'm arguing that cinema does two things at the same time. On the one hand, obviously, when you point a camera at something and you frame it and you film it and you capture it, there's a whole the whole vocabulary of film is kind of aggressive. You frame something, you capture something, you project something. All of that feeds into that trajectory of cinema as a predatory medium, and that's true. I mean, you point a camera at someone or something, you're doing something to it, you're exercising power on it. And I'm trying to highlight that other trajectory which exists simultaneously and always has done, where cinema almost kind of takes a step back from the world rather than enters into it and imposes itself on it. And I'm arguing that you can find that in all of the films right from the very beginning. And the Lumiere films are the very beginnings of cinema, 1895, first year of cinema. And you can see that double trajectory, that simultaneity of predation and nonviolence kind of cohabiting, if you like, in a single film. I mean, the other thing to mention in this context is that this particular film is a lucky find because it actually has eating at its center. So famously in the film, you see it's about 30 seconds long or something like that, and you see a baby eating, and that's the central human drama in the film. But the famous anecdote about this film is that the early audiences who watched the film, what they were really excited by and delighted by was not the baby, but the leaves. The leaves kind of moving in the background, the wind in the leaves, which was moving the wind that was moving the leaves in the background because they're sitting outside in the garden. And I'm arguing that on the one hand, you have this act of devouring that's happening center frame in the film, and then you have this other way of looking, which is kind of like people just kind of scanning the background, the periphery of the frame, and enjoying the fact that there's leaves moving in the wind and no one is telling them to move. There's no human intervention. There's no wind machine making the leaves move. It's just the contingent existence of the earth. And that, interestingly, was what audiences really were amazed by. And to them, that was the great innovation of cinema, because they'd seen babies eat on stage and they'd seen babies eat at home. It was really the leaves in the wind, that non-human activity that was taking place that really, to them, meant something cinematically. And that's the kind of potential that I'm trying to draw out from very early films to more contemporary examples.
So, Anat, is your hope that with this conceptualization, people will be able to look at cinema or look at films in the future and read them through a vegan cinema lens?
Yes, but also be critical of those films that don't do that. So there are many films that, also early ones, I guess, Thomas Edison's Electrocuting an Elephant is perhaps a very good early example of a film that assaults its animal object and devours it and destroys it and kills it. Many of your listeners would know that film, and if they don't, I encourage them to go on to YouTube and watch it. So yeah, my whole aim as a scholar, as a teacher, whatever, is to recalibrate film studies away from an anthropocentric, human-centered lens, but now also to encourage us to think about cinema through this idea of the non-violent, the non-devouring gaze.
Fascinating. Well, Anat, this is the point in the podcast where I normally say, I ask everyone who comes on this podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions? But of course, as listeners will know, you've already been on the podcast before, so you've already answered the 5 quick questions. So excitingly, you're now going to be asked to answer 4 quick questions.
Awesome.
So are you ready for your 4 quick questions, Anat?
Let's do it.
Okay. What's been the most satisfying or rewarding aspect of conducting animal studies research?
Wow, there's quite a few. There's so many. It's pretty great. One thing is the collegiality that I have with other like-minded scholars. I've met a lot of people, including you, and have formed, great and valuable relationships. Within the discipline of film, I guess one of the most rewarding elements is to teach film differently, as I've just explained, to teach it in a non-anthropocentric way and see what happens. It's still new for most students to think of film in this way. And even if they can't quite get it, I think they still appreciate it as a kind of thought experiment. Oh, wow, let's look at the film from the point of view of the leaves or the point of view of the animal. It's something that is kind of mind-blowing to people, and I think that's a lot of fun. But maybe the most exciting thing for me is the sense that with animal studies, we're dealing with fundamentals. In other words, we're really digging deep here to the very source of the question of this structure of power relations in the world. And I think that feels important and urgent.
Lovely. So what's the most challenging or disheartening aspect of conducting animal studies research?
Same as the above, as what I've just said above. I think the worst thing is feeling just how urgent the subject is and how difficult it is to affect any kind of positive change through academic work. Actually, it's really hard to affect positive change through any kind of activity. It's just a really tough subject to be having to deal with on a daily basis, something that really, touches you deeply and is important to you, but you kind of feel that you've chosen what some would call a lost cause as your main subject of inquiry.
Okay, now the third question is a bit of a long one, so bear with me. Once we start having more return guests on, people become more used to the question. I might not have to do it in full, but
okay.
This is the long version. Can you think of an animal studies scholar that you'd like to make listeners aware of? So it could be an emerging scholar, it could be someone who's written in the field but hasn't received the recognition you think they deserve. Perhaps it's someone who's not writing in English and therefore doesn't have the audience they deserve. It could be someone who's doing really relevant animal studies work but is working in a discipline where they don't identify as an animal studies scholar. So it's basically an invitation for a shout out to someone who you think listeners should be aware of, but perhaps they've not come across yet.
Okay. I've got quite a few. I'll narrow down to 3. I'm sorry. But I've been really lucky to get a sneak preview into Laura McMahon's forthcoming book on animals, philosophy, and film. And it's called Animal Worlds. It's going to be published by Edinburgh University Press next year. And Laura's one of the most exciting and profound thinkers in my field, specifically this intersection between film philosophy and animals. And I'm just really excited about her book coming out. But I think many of your listeners may be familiar with Laura's work, but they're not familiar with the new book. So a shout out. It's on its way. I've also recently read really interesting work by Esther Alun. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. And she works, I think she's in Australia. She works on animal rights activism in Israel and Palestine. I think it's a comparative project and explores the animal activism in the context of the Zionist occupation of Palestine and settler colonialism. As an Israeli Jew myself, I think this is something that is close to home for me and matters a great deal to me. So it's really interesting to read that work. And then thirdly, that's a bit of a left field shout out for animal studies people, and maybe even a little controversial for some, is the work of Michael Marder. And he's a plant philosopher, and he's been, I think his work has been the most exciting and exquisite. One of the most exquisite things I've read in a long time. And Marder is working on something quite similar to what I'm doing. He's thinking about ways of existing and flourishing non-violently in the world. For him, the model is is based on what he calls vegetal being. So he's not an animal studies scholar, but I think for me, I feel a great affinity with his project, and I think he has there's a lot that animal studies scholars can take from his work and connections that we can make with his work. So maybe the book that I'm reading now, I think of his, came out last year, and it's called Energy Dreams, and it's absolutely fabulous.
Wonderful. So, fourth and final question. Are you optimistic about the future of human, non-human animal relations?
A real short answer, no. I mean, as I said before, one can elaborate. I'm not at all optimistic, I'm afraid. That's not to say that I'm misanthropic, although I probably am. I think the situation is pretty dire and pretty grave. But I can't quite see how it's going to either improve or resolve itself in any foreseeable future in my lifetime. But as I said earlier, it's kind of interesting, both actually interesting and as a thought experiment to be committed to something like a lost cause. So that's kind of where I am. Sorry. I'm not especially optimistic.
Yeah, no need to apologize. That's a very interesting perspective, Anat, and I'm sure many of your fans will be very interested to hear what you have to say. So, Anat, what are you working on next?
I'm working on a bigger project based on this vegan cinema idea, which is pitched as a book on Simone Weil and film philosophy. So I'm writing a book now on trying to elaborate on this analogy between eating and looking and expanding it and trying to really adapt Weil to film theory, sort of claim her not exactly as a film theorist, but as someone who is relevant to thinking about what it means to gaze non-violently.
Fantastic. And where can people find out more about your work?
I'm on academia.edu, as same as most other people. There's also the Queen Mary website, but I try to put on new publications up on academia, and so it's available there. And of course, everyone can email me. I'm always happy to chat on email, so I'm around.
Okay, well, Anat, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals.
Thank you.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. Now, Are you following us on Twitter at knowing_animals or me at so_s? We've also got a Knowing Animals Facebook page. I've got a Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan Facebook page, and we're also on Instagram at Knowing Animals. Finally, if you've enjoyed this episode, in fact, if you've enjoyed the series, please take a moment to leave us a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us because it sends us sky high in the rankings and makes it a very easy to find podcast. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.